Martin Luther King Jr. stands as one of the most influential figures in modern history, remembered as a relentless advocate for justice, equality, and peace. His leadership during the American Civil Rights Movement in the mid-20th century reshaped the nation's social fabric and inspired global movements for human rights. This chapter sets the stage for understanding the profound impact of King's life and work, exploring his enduring legacy and the ideals that continue to resonate across generations. Born into an era marked by entrenched racial segregation, King emerged as a beacon of hope and resilience. The United States, particularly in the South, was riddled with laws and social norms that perpetuated discrimination against African Americans. This environment of systemic injustice provided the backdrop for King's eventual rise to prominence as a civil rights leader. Yet his legacy extends far beyond his role in specific protests or speeches. It lies in his unwavering belief in the moral necessity of equality and his ability to inspire collective action. The legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. is anchored in his philosophy of nonviolence. Influenced by the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and his own Christian faith, King championed the power of love and peaceful resistance as tools for social change. This approach not only underscored the moral high ground of the civil rights movement, but also proved tactically effective in confronting systemic oppression. The principles King espoused remain a cornerstone of social justice activism, illustrating the enduring relevance of his vision. A hallmark of King's legacy is his capacity to articulate a dream of a better world. His famous "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered during the 1963 March on Washington, encapsulates his vision of a society where individuals are judged by their character rather than the color of their skin. This speech, now iconic, transcends its historical moment, serving as a timeless call for unity, justice, and equality. Through his words, King transformed the aspirations of millions into a collective mission for change. The achievements of the civil rights movement under King's leadership were monumental. Landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were direct outcomes of the movement's persistent efforts. These laws dismantled many legal barriers to racial equality, laying the groundwork for further progress. However, King understood that legislative victories were only one step in the larger struggle against racial and economic inequities, a struggle that continues today. King's influence extended beyond the boundaries of the United States. His work resonated with global movements for independence, justice, and equality, inspiring leaders and activists worldwide. From anti-apartheid efforts in South Africa to human rights campaigns across Asia and Latin America, King's message of universal dignity and nonviolent resistance became a blueprint for transformative action. His legacy as a global figure underscores the universality of his ideals. Despite his achievements, King faced significant opposition and challenges. His calls for racial justice provoked violent backlash from segregationists, while his criticisms of economic inequality and the Vietnam War alienated some of his supporters. These challenges highlight the courage and conviction required to sustain a movement in the face of adversity. King's resilience serves as a reminder of the personal sacrifices necessary for meaningful societal change. King's assassination in 1968 marked a profound loss for the civil rights movement and the world. Yet, his death did not mark the end of his influence. On the contrary, it cemented his role as a martyr for justice, galvanizing continued efforts to realize his vision. The subsequent establishment of Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a federal holiday reflects the enduring recognition of his contributions to the nation's progress. Today, King's legacy remains a source of inspiration and reflection. His words and actions challenge societies to confront their shortcomings and aspire to greater ideals. From the ongoing fight against racial inequality to the broader struggles for social and economic justice, King's message is as relevant as ever. His life serves as a testament to the power of perseverance, moral clarity, and collective action in shaping a more just world. As we delve deeper into the life and work of Martin Luther King Jr. in the chapters to follow, it becomes clear that his legacy is not confined to history books or commemorative events. It is a living testament to the enduring struggle for justice and equality. By examining his journey, we gain valuable insights into the transformative power of leadership, the importance of community, and the unyielding pursuit of a better future. Martin Luther King Jr.'s early years laid the foundation for the values, beliefs, and resilience that would define his leadership in the civil rights movement. Born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, King grew up in a society deeply divided by racial segregation. However, the nurturing environment of his family and the vibrant African-American church community provided him with a sense of identity, purpose, and moral clarity that would shape his worldview. King's family played a pivotal role in his upbringing. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a Baptist minister and a strong advocate for racial equality. Known as Daddy King, he served as both a spiritual leader and a civil rights activist in his own right, instilling in his son a commitment to justice and faith. King's mother, Alberta Williams King, was a teacher and a guiding force in his intellectual development. The King's household emphasized the importance of education, discipline, and moral values, all of which became central to Martin's life. From an early age, King experienced the harsh realities of racism. At just 6 years old, he faced the pain of losing a friendship with a white playmate whose parents disapproved of their association. This formative incident introduced King to the deeply entrenched racial prejudices that would fuel his lifelong quest for equality. Yet, rather than succumbing to bitterness, King channeled these experiences into a drive to understand and confront the systems of oppression around him. Education was a cornerstone of King's development. A gifted student, he excelled academically, skipping grades and entering Morehouse College at the age of 15. Located in Atlanta, Morehouse was a prestigious historically black college that nurtured many prominent African-American leaders. Under the mentorship of influential figures such as Dr. Benjamin Mays, Morehouse's president and a staunch advocate for civil rights, King's intellectual and spiritual horizons expanded. Mays, in particular, emphasized the compatibility of faith and social activism, a theme that would later define King's leadership style. King's upbringing in the African-American church also profoundly shaped his identity and mission. The Ebenezer Baptist Church, where his father served as pastor, was not only a place of worship, but also a hub for community activism and social support. The church's emphasis on collective action and spiritual strength resonated deeply with King. He absorbed lessons on the power of faith to overcome adversity and the importance of addressing social injustices through moral courage. While King's early years were steeped in traditional religious teachings, his intellectual journey introduced him to a broader range of philosophical and ethical perspectives. During his studies at Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, he encountered the works of Mahatma Gandhi, whose philosophy of nonviolent resistance profoundly influenced King's approach to social change. King also studied the writings of Henry David Thoreau, whose essay on civil disobedience further solidified his belief in the moral obligation to challenge unjust laws. King's personal experiences with racism continued to fuel his determination to seek change. One particularly impactful moment occurred during a trip to Connecticut in his teenage years, where he encountered a society that was far less segregated than the South. The relative freedom he experienced there starkly contrasted with the systemic racism of his hometown. This experience reinforced his conviction that racial inequality was not an inevitability, but a societal construct that could and must be dismantled. The King family's commitment to justice extended beyond Martin's immediate household. His maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, had been a minister and activist advocating for black voting rights in the early 20th century. This legacy of advocacy and resilience provided King with a historical perspective on the struggle for equality, reminding him that his efforts were part of a larger continuum of resistance and progress. King's marriage to Coretta Scott in 1953 added another dimension to his life and mission. Coretta, an accomplished musician and activist, shared King's commitment to social justice and became his steadfast partner in the movement. Their relationship was a testament to the importance of mutual support and shared vision in the pursuit of transformative change. By the time King completed his doctoral studies at Boston University in 1955, he was equipped with a unique combination of intellectual rigor, spiritual depth, and personal resilience. These early influences, his family, education, religious upbringing, and encounters with racism, had coalesced into a powerful sense of purpose. King was not only prepared to confront the challenges of his time, but also to inspire others to join him in the struggle for a more just and equitable society. As the chapters that follow will reveal, King's early life was not merely a prelude to his later achievements, but an essential foundation for his enduring legacy. His experiences and influences during these formative years provided him with the tools and perspective needed to lead a movement that would transform the United States and inspire the world. Martin Luther King Jr.'s journey from seminary to social advocacy was marked by profound intellectual growth, spiritual refinement, and the realization of his role as a leader in the struggle for justice. This chapter explores how King's theological studies, personal experiences, and early ministry contributed to the development of his activist philosophy and prepared him for the challenges of the civil rights movement. King's enrollment at Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, in 1948 was a pivotal moment in his intellectual and spiritual development. At Crozer, King encountered a diverse environment that challenged him to think critically about issues of race, religion, and social justice. Unlike the segregated South where he grew up, Crozer offered an integrated academic setting where King interacted with people from different racial and cultural backgrounds. These interactions helped shape his understanding of the universality of human dignity and the need for collective action to combat injustice. During his time at Crozer, King was introduced to a broad spectrum of philosophical and theological ideas. Among the most influential was the philosophy of nonviolent resistance championed by Mahatma Gandhi. King studied Gandhi's strategies for opposing British colonial rule in India and was deeply inspired by the effectiveness of nonviolence as a tool for social and political change. This exposure to Gandhi's ideas planted the seeds of a nonviolent approach that would later become the cornerstone of King's leadership. King's theological education also exposed him to Christian liberalism, which emphasized the social dimensions of faith. The works of theologians such as Walter Rauschenbusch, a proponent of the social gospel, resonated with King's belief in the moral responsibility of the church to address societal inequities. Rauschenbusch's call to action against systemic poverty and injustice aligned with King's growing commitment to integrating spiritual principles with practical activism. While King was inspired by the ideals of nonviolence and social justice, his studies also deepened his understanding of the complex relationship between faith and activism. He grappled with questions about how to reconcile theological doctrines with the harsh realities of oppression and discrimination. This intellectual struggle helped King refine his belief that religion must serve as a transformative force in society, challenging injustice and fostering reconciliation. King's time at Boston University, where he pursued his doctoral studies, further solidified his philosophical and ethical framework. At Boston, he studied under prominent scholars who encouraged critical thinking and rigorous scholarship. His doctoral dissertation, which explored the conceptions of God in the works of theologians Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Weeman, reflected his deep engagement with the interplay between faith and reason. This academic grounding gave King the intellectual confidence to articulate his vision of a just society with clarity and conviction. In addition to his formal education, King's personal experiences during this period reinforced his commitment to activism. He witnessed firsthand the systemic injustices faced by African Americans, including economic inequality, voter suppression, and racial violence. These experiences fueled his sense of urgency and responsibility to advocate for change. At the same time, his interactions with individuals from different walks of life broadened his perspective and deepened his empathy for marginalized communities. King's marriage to Coretta Scott in 1953 marked the beginning of a partnership that would play a crucial role in his activism. Coretta, an accomplished artist and a committed advocate for social justice, shared King's vision for a better world. Together, they envisioned a life dedicated to advancing civil rights and addressing systemic inequalities. Coretta's unwavering support and activism complemented King's leadership, making their partnership a cornerstone of the movement. As King transitioned into his role as a pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1954, he began to merge his theological insights with practical activism. The church became a platform for community organization and a hub for addressing local issues of racial injustice. King's sermons during this time reflected his growing conviction that faith must inspire action, emphasizing themes of love, justice, and nonviolence. By the mid-1950s, King had developed a comprehensive framework for activism that combined intellectual rigor, spiritual depth, and practical strategies for change. His experiences at seminary and in the ministry equipped him with the tools to lead a movement that would challenge systemic racism and inspire millions. The foundation laid during these formative years would soon be tested and expanded as King assumed leadership of the Montgomery bus boycott, a pivotal event that marked the beginning of his national prominence as a civil rights leader. This chapter highlights how King's education and early ministry shaped his approach to activism. It was during these years that he synthesized the ideas, values, and strategies that would define his leadership. The lessons King learned and the relationships he formed provided him with the resilience and vision needed to confront the immense challenges ahead. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 1956 was a watershed moment in the civil rights movement and marked the emergence of Martin Luther King Jr. as a national leader. This chapter examines the events leading to the boycott, King's pivotal role, and the broader implications of this historic act of resistance. It was during this campaign that King's vision of nonviolent resistance was put into practice, setting the tone for the movement that would reshape American society. The boycott was sparked by Rosa Parks' arrest on December 1, 1955, for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white passenger. Parks, a longtime activist and secretary of the local NAACP chapter, symbolized the everyday indignities endured by African Americans under segregation. Her arrest catalyzed the African American community in Montgomery, Alabama, into collective action. The incident underscored the systemic nature of racial discrimination and highlighted the urgent need for organized resistance. King's involvement in the boycott was serendipitous yet transformative. At the time, he was a relatively new pastor at Montgomery's Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Despite his youth and lack of political experience, King's eloquence, charisma, and moral conviction made him an ideal choice to lead the movement. On December 5, 1955, he was elected president of the newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, the organization spearheading the boycott. From the outset, King emphasized the principles of nonviolence and Christian love as the foundation of the boycott. Drawing on the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and his own theological beliefs, King articulated a strategy that rejected physical violence and focused on moral persuasion. He believed that nonviolent resistance not only demonstrated the righteousness of their cause, but also held the potential to transform the hearts of oppressors. The boycott's success depended on the collective resolve of Montgomery's African American community, which made up the majority of the city's bus ridership. For over a year, African Americans refused to use the city's buses, opting instead to walk, carpool, or organize alternative transportation systems. This act of economic withdrawal placed significant pressure on the bus company and the city government, highlighting the power of collective action in challenging systemic injustice. King's leadership during the boycott faced significant challenges. He and other activists endured harassment, arrests, and threats to their lives. On January 30, 1956, King's home was bombed while his wife, Coretta, and their infant daughter were inside. Miraculously, they were unharmed, but the attack underscored the violent resistance to desegregation efforts. Despite these dangers, King remained steadfast, urging the community to respond with courage and nonviolence. The boycott also revealed the interconnectedness of local struggles and national civil rights efforts. The legal battle accompanying the boycott culminated in a landmark decision by the Supreme Court, which ruled in Browder v. Gale, 1956, that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. This victory not only ended the Montgomery bus boycott, but also set a precedent for future challenges to segregation laws across the South. The boycott catapulted King into the national spotlight, establishing him as the face of the burgeoning civil rights movement. His leadership during the campaign demonstrated his ability to inspire, organize, and mobilize communities in the face of adversity. King's speeches and writings during this time showcased his rhetorical brilliance and moral authority, qualities that would define his role as a leader in subsequent campaigns. Beyond the immediate impact on Montgomery, the boycott represented a turning point in the struggle for civil rights. It demonstrated the power of grassroots activism and the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance. The campaign also inspired other communities to adopt similar strategies, laying the groundwork for a broader movement that would challenge racial injustice on a national scale. The Montgomery bus boycott was more than a local protest. It was the birth of a movement and a leader. King's leadership during this campaign set the stage for his role in the civil rights movement and cemented his philosophy of nonviolence as a guiding principle. The boycott not only challenged segregation in Montgomery, but also ignited a moral and political awakening that would transform the United States. As the chapters ahead will reveal, King's journey was just beginning, and the principles he championed in Montgomery would continue to shape the fight for justice and equality. Central to Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership in the civil rights movement was his philosophy of nonviolence. This chapter explores the origins, principles, and application of King's commitment to nonviolent resistance, as well as the profound impact it had on the movement and beyond. King's philosophy was not merely a tactic, but a deeply held moral conviction, grounded in his Christian faith, his study of Mahatma Gandhi, and his belief in the transformative power of love and justice. Nonviolence, for King, was more than an absence of physical aggression. It was an active force for social and moral transformation. Influenced by the teachings of Jesus Christ, King viewed nonviolence as a way to embody Christian love, or agape. This form of love was not sentimental, but selfless, extending even to one's adversaries. For King, loving one's enemies did not mean accepting injustice, but confronting it in a way that sought reconciliation rather than retribution. A key influence on King's philosophy was Mahatma Gandhi, whose leadership in India's struggle for independence demonstrated the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance. King was particularly inspired by Gandhi's concept of satyagraha, or truth force, which emphasized the power of moral truth to overcome oppression. King believed that nonviolence was not only ethically superior, but also strategically effective in exposing the injustices of segregation and racism to a wider audience. King outlined 6 principles of nonviolence, which formed the foundation of his approach to social change. These principles emphasized that nonviolence was a way of life for courageous individuals, sought to win friendship and understanding, aimed to defeat injustice rather than individuals, held that suffering could educate and transform, chose love over hate, and believed that the universe was on the side of justice. These principles guided the civil rights movement's actions and distinguished it from other forms of protest. The practical application of nonviolence required discipline, patience, and strategic planning. Participants in the movement were trained in nonviolent resistance, learning how to endure verbal and physical assaults without retaliating. This discipline was crucial in maintaining the moral high ground and preventing the movement from being discredited by accusations of violence. King emphasized that nonviolence was not passive, but an active confrontation of injustice, requiring courage and determination. One of the most significant demonstrations of nonviolent resistance was the Birmingham Campaign of 1963. This campaign, organized by King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, sought to challenge segregation through marches, sit-ins, and boycotts. The campaign's nonviolent tactics were met with brutal responses from law enforcement, including the use of fire hoses and police dogs against peaceful protesters. The images of this violence, broadcast nationwide, elicited widespread sympathy for the movement and highlighted the stark contrast between the protesters' dignity and the oppressor's brutality. Nonviolence also played a central role in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. King's iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered at the march, articulated a vision of a just and inclusive society. The peaceful nature of the march, attended by over 250,000 people, demonstrated the power of nonviolent collective action and solidified the movement's moral authority. Critics of nonviolence questioned its effectiveness and moral foundation, particularly in the face of persistent violence and systemic oppression. Some activists, frustrated by the slow pace of change, advocated for more confrontational or militant approaches. King, however, remained steadfast in his belief that nonviolence was the most effective way to achieve lasting change. He argued that violence, while offering the illusion of immediate power, ultimately perpetuated cycles of hatred and destruction. The philosophy of nonviolence extended beyond the civil rights movement, influencing global struggles for justice and human rights. Leaders such as Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu in South Africa, as well as figures and movements across Asia and Latin America, drew inspiration from King's approach. Nonviolence became a universal language of resistance, demonstrating its adaptability and relevance in diverse contexts. King's commitment to nonviolence was not without personal cost. He endured threats, harassment, and physical attacks, yet he never wavered in his principles. His unwavering faith in nonviolence was a testament to his moral courage and belief in the possibility of a better world. As subsequent chapters will explore, the challenges King faced only deepened his resolve to advocate for justice through peaceful means. The philosophy of nonviolence remains one of King's most enduring legacies, a reminder of the transformative power of love, truth, and moral conviction. The Birmingham Campaign of 1963 was a defining moment in Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership of the civil rights movement. It showcased his ability to combine moral vision, strategic planning, and personal courage in the face of adversity. This chapter examines the campaign's objectives, the challenges faced by King and the movement, and the lasting significance of the powerful letter from Birmingham jail, which remains one of the most eloquent defenses of nonviolent resistance and social justice. Birmingham, Alabama, was chosen as the focal point of the campaign due to its reputation as one of the most segregated and racially oppressive cities in the United States. The city's African-American population faced widespread discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations, and attempts to challenge these injustices were met with violent resistance. Under the leadership of Eugene Bull Connor, the city's public safety commissioner, Birmingham became a symbol of entrenched racism and brutality. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, led by King, collaborated with local activists to launch the Birmingham Campaign in April 1963. The campaign aimed to desegregate public facilities, secure fair hiring practices, and promote racial justice through nonviolent direct action. Tactics included marches, sit-ins, and boycotts, designed to provoke a crisis that would force city leaders to negotiate and address the demands of the movement. From the outset, the campaign faced significant challenges. Initial demonstrations were met with mass arrests, including the detention of King himself on April 12, 1963. The local clergy, including some sympathetic to the cause, criticized the campaign, calling it untimely and disruptive. In response, King penned his now famous letter from Birmingham jail, a document that articulated the moral and philosophical underpinnings of the movement. The letter from Birmingham jail is widely regarded as one of the most important writings of the civil rights era. In it, King responded to the criticisms of the local clergy, arguing that the fight for justice could not be delayed. "Justice too long delayed is justice denied," he wrote, emphasizing the urgency of addressing systemic racism. King asserted that nonviolent direct action was necessary to create the tension that would compel society to confront and resolve its injustices. One of the letter's most poignant passages addressed the concept of just versus unjust laws. Drawing on theological and philosophical traditions, King argued that individuals had a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws, which he defined as laws that degraded human dignity or were imposed without the consent of those affected. His reasoning provided a powerful ethical framework for civil disobedience and underscored the moral legitimacy of the movement. The Birmingham Campaign escalated in May 1963, when the movement began recruiting children and teenagers to participate in demonstrations, a strategy known as the Children's Crusade. This decision was controversial, but effective in drawing national attention. Images of young protesters being attacked by police dogs and fire hoses shocked the conscience of the nation and highlighted the brutality of segregation. The media coverage galvanized public opinion and increased pressure on the federal government to intervene. The campaign's nonviolent approach, despite the violence it provoked, ultimately succeeded in achieving its goals. After weeks of sustained protest and negotiation, local business leaders agreed to desegregate lunch counters, remove discriminatory hiring practices, and release jailed protesters. While the agreement was a significant victory, it also provoked violent backlash, including bombings at the 16th Street Baptist Church and King's Hotel. The Birmingham campaign had far-reaching implications for the civil rights movement and the nation as a whole. It demonstrated the effectiveness of nonviolent direct action in confronting systemic injustice and the power of media to shape public opinion. The campaign also laid the groundwork for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed segregation in public facilities and employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. King's leadership during the Birmingham campaign solidified his position as the moral voice of the civil rights movement. His letter from Birmingham jail remains a timeless call to action, challenging individuals and societies to confront injustice and uphold the principles of equality and human dignity. The campaign itself stands as a testament to the courage, resilience, and strategic brilliance of the movement. As the movement progressed, King and his allies faced even greater challenges and opportunities, including the March on Washington and the passage of landmark legislation. However, the lessons of Birmingham continued to inform their strategies and inspire their vision. The campaign was not just a victory for Birmingham's African-American community, but a milestone in the broader struggle for civil rights and social justice. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, held on August 28, 1963, was one of the most iconic events in the civil rights movement and a defining moment in Martin Luther King Jr.'s career. This chapter explores the origins, planning, and execution of the march, as well as the lasting impact of King's "I Have a Dream" speech, which articulated a powerful vision for racial equality and justice in America. The march was conceived as a collaborative effort between civil rights leaders and organizations to demand civil and economic rights for African Americans. The event was co-organized by A. Philip Randolph, a veteran labor activist, and Bayard Rustin, a skilled strategist and organizer. Together, they envisioned a mass demonstration that would highlight the urgency of addressing racial inequality and economic injustice in the United States. The timing of the march was critical. The civil rights movement had gained momentum following the Birmingham campaign, but racial violence and systemic discrimination persisted. The federal government, under President John F. Kennedy, was preparing to introduce landmark civil rights legislation. Organizers sought to build public pressure on Congress to pass the proposed legislation and to emphasize the interconnectedness of racial and economic justice. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, played a central role in mobilizing support for the march. Despite initial skepticism from some quarters, including the White House, the march quickly gained broad support from civil rights organizations, labor unions, religious groups, and individuals across the country. It became a unifying event that transcended regional, racial, and ideological divides. On the day of the march, more than 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., making it one of the largest demonstrations in U.S. history. The diverse crowd included people of all races, ages, and walks of life, reflecting the widespread appeal of the movement's goals. The peaceful and orderly nature of the march demonstrated the discipline and unity of the civil rights movement and countered stereotypes of African Americans as unruly or disruptive. The program featured speeches, musical performances, and prayers, all aimed at inspiring and galvanizing the audience. Among the speakers were prominent leaders such as A. Philip Randolph, John Lewis, and Mahalia Jackson, whose performances stirred the crowd. However, it was Martin Luther King Jr.'s address that would come to define the event and resonate through history. King's speech, delivered at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, began with a reflection on the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation and the failure of the nation to fulfill its pledge of equality. He described the pervasive injustices faced by African Americans, including police brutality, voter suppression, and economic disparity. His words struck a chord, framing the civil rights struggle as part of America's unfinished business of realizing its founding ideals. The most memorable section of King's speech, known as the "I Have a Dream" passage, was not part of his prepared remarks. Prompted by gospel singer Mahalia Jackson's call to tell them about the dream, King improvised a powerful vision of racial harmony and justice. He spoke of a future where his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, evoking both hope and a moral imperative for change. The "I Have a Dream" speech was a masterful blend of moral conviction, rhetorical brilliance, and deep emotional resonance. Drawing on the Bible, the Constitution, and the Declaration of Independence, King framed the civil rights movement as a fulfillment of America's highest ideals. His dream of equality and unity transcended the immediate demands of the movement, offering a universal message of human dignity and freedom. The March on Washington had a profound impact on the civil rights movement and the nation. It galvanized support for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which would outlaw segregation in public spaces and ban employment discrimination. The march also cemented King's reputation as the moral leader of the movement and a global symbol of nonviolent resistance to oppression. The legacy of the march and King's speech continues to inspire movements for justice and equality worldwide. It demonstrated the power of peaceful collective action to bring about social change and underscored the importance of moral leadership in the fight against injustice. For King, the march was both a milestone and a reminder of the work that remained to be done, as he continued to push for systemic change in the face of persistent challenges. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 marked a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement and was a testament to the perseverance of Martin Luther King Jr. and his allies. This chapter delves into the context, challenges, and impact of the landmark legislation, highlighting King's role in rallying public support and navigating the political complexities of the era. By the early 1960s, the civil rights movement had exposed the moral and legal failures of segregation. Events like the Birmingham Campaign and the March on Washington galvanized national attention, placing immense pressure on lawmakers to act. However, despite growing public support, passing comprehensive civil rights legislation faced significant opposition from entrenched political and social forces, particularly in the South. President John F. Kennedy first proposed the Civil Rights Bill in June 1963, emphasizing the need to end segregation in public places and prohibit discrimination in employment. Following Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson took up the cause, framing the legislation as a continuation of Kennedy's legacy and a moral imperative for the nation. Johnson's political acumen and determination proved instrumental in advancing the bill through Congress. King's involvement in the push for the Civil Rights Act was multifaceted. As a leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, he worked to maintain public pressure on lawmakers by organizing marches, rallies, and speeches. King emphasized the moral urgency of the legislation, framing it as a matter of justice and equality rather than mere political expediency. His ability to articulate the human impact of discrimination made the case for the bill compelling to a broad audience. Despite these efforts, the bill faced fierce resistance in Congress, particularly from Southern legislators who sought to preserve segregation. The Senate filibuster, led by opponents of the bill, lasted for a record-breaking 60 days. Advocates for the legislation, including King and his allies, mobilized public opinion to counteract this opposition, emphasizing the broad support for civil rights across the nation. King's advocacy extended beyond public rallies and speeches. He engaged in behind-the-scenes lobbying, meeting with lawmakers and urging them to support the bill. King's moral authority and the movement's grassroots power provided a critical counterbalance to the political influence of segregationist forces. His ability to connect the struggle for civil rights with America's democratic ideals resonated with many legislators and helped shift the debate. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law by President Johnson on July 2, 1964. The legislation was sweeping in its scope, banning segregation in public facilities, prohibiting employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and strengthening voting rights protections. It represented a significant victory for the civil rights movement and a milestone in the nation's journey toward equality. For King, the passage of the Civil Rights Act was a moment of triumph, but also a reminder of the work that remained. While the legislation addressed legal segregation, it did not eliminate systemic racism, economic inequality, or voter suppression. King viewed the act as a foundation upon which further progress could be built, particularly in areas like voting rights and economic justice. The broader implications of the Civil Rights Act extended beyond the African American community. The legislation inspired other movements for social justice, including those advocating for women's rights, immigrant rights, and LGBTQ+ equality. It also set a precedent for federal intervention in issues of discrimination, establishing the principle that civil rights are a matter of national concern. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not merely a legislative achievement. It was a testament to the power of collective action, moral courage, and strategic leadership. King's role in this historic moment reflected his unwavering commitment to justice and his belief in the transformative potential of democracy. As the movement pressed forward, King and his allies turned their attention to new challenges, including securing voting rights and addressing the deep economic disparities that continued to plague the nation. The passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was another landmark achievement in the civil rights movement, and it marked a decisive step toward securing the full promise of American democracy for African Americans. This chapter explores the context and events that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, Martin Luther King Jr.'s role in advocating for it, and the broader implications it had for the struggle for racial equality in the United States. By the mid-1960s, although significant progress had been made through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, racial inequality and discrimination persisted, especially in the realm of voting rights. In many southern states, African Americans were effectively disenfranchised through a combination of literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright intimidation. In places like Mississippi and Alabama, even where African Americans made up the majority of the population, they were systematically excluded from the political process. The right to vote, fundamental to full citizenship, was denied to millions of African Americans. King's focus on voting rights was galvanized by these realities. Although the Civil Rights Act had banned segregation and discrimination in public accommodations and employment, the fight for political equality remained unresolved. In the face of continued disenfranchisement, King and other civil rights leaders recognized that the federal government needed to intervene to ensure that African Americans could exercise their right to vote. The Selma to Montgomery marches of 1965 played a central role in raising national awareness about the need for federal voting rights protections. In early 1965, local activists in Selma, Alabama, began organizing protests to demand voting rights for African Americans. However, the response from local law enforcement was brutal. On Bloody Sunday, March 7, 1965, state troopers and local police viciously attacked demonstrators, many of whom were nonviolent. The violence captured on television shocked the conscience of the nation and galvanized support for federal intervention. King, who had been involved in the Selma protests from the beginning, recognized that the movement needed to secure federal action to address the systemic barriers to voting. In response to the violence and the national outcry, King and other leaders called for a march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital, to demand the right to vote. The march, intended to symbolize the African American struggle for equality, was met with resistance at every stage, but it ultimately succeeded in drawing attention to the issue of voting rights. The marches in Selma were pivotal in shifting public opinion and influencing Congress. The images of peaceful protesters being beaten and tear-gassed, contrasted with the dignity and resolve of the marchers, reinforced the moral legitimacy of their cause. King's leadership during the marches demonstrated his ability to maintain discipline and moral clarity even in the face of violence, reinforcing his status as the moral leader of the movement. In response to the outcry from Selma and the broader civil rights movement, President Lyndon B. Johnson introduced the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The bill aimed to eliminate discriminatory practices such as literacy tests and poll taxes, which had long been used to disenfranchise African Americans. It also authorized federal oversight in areas with a history of voter suppression, ensuring that federal authorities could intervene to protect voting rights when necessary. King and the SCLC were instrumental in building public support for the Voting Rights Act, organizing rallies, marches, and lobbying efforts to ensure its passage. King's moral vision, combined with the movement's strategic activism, helped turn the momentum in favor of the bill. In his speeches, King emphasized that the right to vote was essential for achieving social justice and racial equality. He also framed the fight for voting rights as part of the broader struggle for economic justice and human dignity. The Voting Rights Act was signed into law by President Johnson on August 6, 1965. It represented one of the most significant legal victories of the civil rights movement and was hailed as a triumph for the African American community. The act fundamentally transformed American politics by opening the doors of the ballot box to millions of disenfranchised voters and curtailing the power of discriminatory practices that had long excluded African Americans from the democratic process. While the Voting Rights Act was a monumental achievement, it was also a reminder of the long road ahead. Although the act addressed many of the legal barriers to voting, other forms of disenfranchisement, such as gerrymandering, voter ID laws, and felony disenfranchisement, would continue to persist. King's work was far from over, and his focus began to shift toward economic justice and the fight for fair housing, education, and employment. The Voting Rights Act marked a victory, but the struggle for racial equality and social justice would require continued activism and vigilance. The passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 not only empowered African Americans politically, but also solidified the federal government's role in safeguarding civil rights. King's leadership in the Selma campaign and his advocacy for the Voting Rights Act demonstrated the centrality of nonviolent resistance and moral persuasion in achieving systemic change. The law helped fulfill the promise of the 15th Amendment, ensuring that African Americans had an unencumbered right to vote. However, King's broader vision for racial and economic justice remained unfulfilled, and the movement would continue to evolve in response to the changing realities of racial inequality in America. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968, shocked the world and left a profound void in the civil rights movement. Yet his legacy, both as a moral leader and a strategic visionary, continues to shape the ongoing struggle for racial justice, equality, and human dignity in the United States and globally. This chapter explores the enduring impact of King's work, the challenges that remain in the fight for civil rights, and the lessons that his life and leadership offer to future generations. King's assassination marked the end of a pivotal era in the civil rights movement. His death was not only a tragic loss for the movement, but also a powerful symbol of the high stakes of the fight for racial equality. Despite the setback, the movement he helped lead had already achieved major legislative victories, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws represented a shift in the nation's legal framework, guaranteeing civil rights and protections for African Americans that had previously been denied. However, King had always maintained that legislative change was only one part of the larger struggle, and much work remained to fully address the systemic nature of racism, economic inequality, and social injustice. King's legacy is often associated with his commitment to nonviolent resistance, a strategy he inherited from Mahatma Gandhi and adapted to the American context. His belief in nonviolence was not merely a tactic, it was a moral principle rooted in his Christian faith and his understanding of human dignity. King's leadership demonstrated that social change could be achieved through peaceful means, even in the face of violence and hatred. This approach was revolutionary in a time when many were tempted by more radical, violent forms of protest. King's ability to maintain moral clarity in the face of adversity remains one of his greatest contributions to political and social movements worldwide. Yet, King's vision extended beyond the struggle for racial equality. He also understood that true justice could not be achieved without addressing economic inequality. As early as the 1960s, King had begun to focus on issues like poverty, unemployment, and inadequate housing, realizing that racial justice and economic justice were inextricably linked. His Poor People's Campaign, which aimed to address the economic struggles of African Americans and poor people of all races, became a central focus in the last years of his life. While the campaign was interrupted by his assassination, its message resonated with activists who recognized that the fight for equality must also include efforts to dismantle the structures of poverty and economic disenfranchisement. King's legacy is further embedded in the ongoing struggles for racial justice. Although significant strides have been made, African Americans and other marginalized communities continue to face challenges in areas such as education, employment, and criminal justice. The disproportionate incarceration of Black Americans, voter suppression tactics, and the ongoing impact of systemic racism reflect the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. In many ways, King's vision of a beloved community, a society where justice, peace, and equality prevail, remains an aspirational goal, but one that is still being pursued by activists and organizations today. The impact of King's work has also been felt in international movements for human rights and justice. His advocacy for nonviolence and civil disobedience inspired leaders around the world, from Nelson Mandela in South Africa to Cesar Chavez in the United States. King's ideas about equality, human dignity, and justice transcend national borders, and his teachings continue to influence global movements for freedom and democracy. The global resonance of his message underscores the universality of the struggle for justice, connecting the civil rights movement to broader struggles against colonialism, apartheid, and oppression. Despite the monumental legal and social changes that followed King's leadership, the nation's racial divisions remain deep and entrenched. The 21st century has seen a resurgence of racial tensions, exemplified by movements such as Black Lives Matter, which seeks to address police violence, racial profiling, and the systemic inequities that persist in American society. These contemporary movements draw on King's legacy, embracing his commitment to nonviolence, while also demanding accountability and structural change. They also reflect a growing recognition that King's vision for equality must be expanded to address the intersections of race, gender, and class. King's speeches, writings, and actions continue to serve as a moral compass for social justice movements. His "I Have a Dream" speech remains an enduring symbol of the nation's ideals, reminding Americans of the need to fulfill the promises of liberty and equality. King's insistence on the power of love and forgiveness, even in the face of hatred, challenges us to envision a better world based on compassion and understanding. His leadership in the civil rights movement was not only about winning legal victories, it was about transforming the moral consciousness of the nation. The legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. is not just about the victories of the 1960s. It is also about the ongoing work of creating a more just society. His life and work remind us that the struggle for equality and justice is never fully realized, but is instead a continuous process that requires commitment, perseverance, and courage. The lessons of King's leadership are particularly relevant today, as society continues to confront racial inequality, economic injustice, and social division. Ultimately, Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy calls on each generation to take up the mantle of justice. His life teaches us that real change comes not through violence or division, but through love, solidarity, and the relentless pursuit of equality for all people. While the specific challenges may change, the need for moral leadership and the quest for a society grounded in justice remains as urgent as ever. King's legacy is not only the history of a movement, but a vision of a future that is yet to be fully realized. A vision of a world where freedom, dignity, and equality are afforded to every individual, regardless of race, background, or circumstance.